Well, it's an absolute fantastic pleasure for me to be here amongst so many friends, former pupils, most of the people whom I admire most in the world of Anglo-American theology. And I think it's possible to have perhaps the most creative discussions when there's a certain field of shared agreement. And then I think discussion can be more positive, and that's what I'm finding here. I'm enormously grateful to the Templeton Trust for inviting me. In my view, thinking about the soul today, there is no more crucial project, and there is absolutely no finer mind to be undertaking it than David Bentley Hart. Unlike Paul, I admire his style enormously, and I think the substance is sort of okay. More seriously, David and I are always kind of sparking off each other, and we only do that because the levels of agreement between us are so astonishingly great. And I think by our own independent paths, we've been advocates for, quite simply, the idea that the analogical participatory view of reality is indispensable for genuine Orthodox Christianity. So it's simply a real delight to be here. I'm following the original instructions, which were not to give a paper. So, like some other people as well, I'm assuming that we're here to respond to what David has said and to throw out some informal remarks. So I'm going to take the opportunity to do what one can't really so easily do in a formal paper, to speculate and throw out possible provocative suggestions for where things might go in the future. Perhaps surprisingly, I'm very much in sympathy with a lot of what Paul has just said, and in some ways my remarks will, I think, flow quite well from his. David has further explained what he's doing, that in many ways strategically he's starting with the modern so-called post-critical positions which privilege epistemology, and he's trying to dismantle them while sometimes learning some things from them. And he seemed, by following that route, to land up with the unavoidable and I think totally true idea that there is nothing that exists that doesn't appear and therefore is thinkable. Therefore, there appears to be some kind of esoteric link between thought and reality. So a massive problem, if you like, of correlation, as Meillassoux has now termed it, and a seemingly one-off, single, magical relationship that is hard to penetrate. Now, the alternative way of looking at that situation, which David himself invoked, is to suggest that it's not so much that one has an ultimate duality, but that thought emerges much more integrally from natural processes. But in a sense, that is to multiply the dualities, the duality, for example, of thought and matter, of sensing and things sensed. And the outcome of that is perhaps not that one has sort of one great anomaly, as one does after Descartes, but rather that the world is full of correlative mysteries, that all the way down there seem to be polar dualities, perhaps of the kind that John Betts was talking about as explored by Shivara, linked polarities in tension. So there's not just one mystery of an occult link, one magical mystery, but the whole universe is penetrated by these mysteries of occult connections. and in many ways, the transition from the pre-modern to the modern has to do, as people said time and again in the 17th century, with the sense that the Aristotelian and Neoplatonic traditions failed to see that the connections they were talking about were rather occult in character. And I think at that point, the great split, this is a rather controversial thing to say, the real split in thought is between people who are trying to get rid of anything that smells of magic, to go completely rationalist, to want everything to be absolutely transparent, in the wake of the Scotists and then the nominalists in the late Middle Ages. There are those people on the one hand. In the middle, there are the neo-scholastics who are in fact continuing a scholasticism much contaminated by Scotus and nominalism and so on. But then the people who I think are more defending the great tradition, and this is a very, very controversial thing to say, are the people who are in the line of something like Renaissance magic. And they're saying, yes, we now freely admit that something like analogy is paradoxical. Already in Proclus, it's linked to notions of occult connections, and we are openly embracing that tradition. And for this reason, I have great sympathy with people like Michael Martin who are reconsidering figures like Robert Flood, who are not heterodox, but are deeply hermeticist. It may be that today, to be Thomistic, you have to take on board a lot of theurgic Neoplatonism and even elements of the Hermetic tradition, if you are to sustain precisely the kind of things that Aquinas wanted to sustain. And so I think there is an alternative report in modernity. And my view would be that if one wants to sort of redefend traditional metaphysics about the soul, one needs to look at these alternative reports in the modern era. And there are several dimensions to this I'll try and go into a little later on, rather than conceding anything at all to the epistemological turn, which I think is simply a mistake. So you don't concede anything to Descartes and Kant because there is another way to be modern, a much more interesting way to be modern. And Descartes and Kant are in fact rooted in a weaker pre-modern tradition. So what I want to talk about first is the way in which there are tensions in the inherited tradition about the soul, and in some ways to sort of complicate the pre-modern, modern contrast by stressing the way in which the dominant route of modernity, which is to do with epistemology and the turn to the subject, is rooted in one strand of preceding tradition rather than another strand. So to some extent, I'm wanting to call into question these rather sharp divisions of the pre-modern and the modern. Now, it seems to me that the biggest tension in the pre-modern outlook is quite simply, on the one hand, mind and consciousness are seen as very much associated with soul, which is seen as a natural reality. And on the other hand, mind is seen as transcending natural reality as something eternal. And quite obviously, we associate the latter view more with Plato, and we associate the former view more with Aristotle. Nonetheless, it would be quite wrong to see this in traditional terms as a Platonic versus Aristotelian tension. The tension is in Aristotle himself, in the De Anima, where he insists on the one hand that thinking is an accidental property of soul, and yet on the other hand, he intimates that there is an aspect of thinking that links it with eternal contemplation of the first mover. And Aristotle himself in that dialogue uses methexis language in that treatise, uses methexis language at some points. I also think that the tension cleaves Neoplatonism, but in a slightly different way. It's very important, I think, here to note just how different the conception of mind is in Neoplatonism from our modern conception. So we think of mind as something like the mirror of nature in a very broad sense. We think of mind as sort of looking outside itself, as having this sort of observation task. Whereas for Plotinus, mind transcends soul precisely because mind doesn't go outside itself. Mind is purely self-reflexive. Mind is purely involved with itself. And what defines soul for for Plotinus, is precisely the fact that it relates outside itself. That's why it is the principle of movement. So this means that on the one hand, mind is very much to do with sort of leaving behind our current thought, our current consciousness, if you like, as in the way that Paul puts it. But on the other hand, mind is thinking is very much only one aspect of soul. For Neoplatonism, as for Aristotle, soul is about motion and about sensation. And motion and sensation are intimately linked. So they don't have this kind of Lockean problem of how is it that you correlate mind and sensation and world, because sensation is bound up with motion. In motion, two things are sensing each other, and then that is in some way internalized to create something like sensation. And as people like Hella Rosen have stressed, and maybe this chimes with what Paul is saying as well, it's remarkable how uninterested in consciousness people were in the pre-modern era, and that they were often more interested in synesthesia, or in the reflexivity of sensation. And that's one reason why they didn't have an enormous duality between animal life and human life. One reason they didn't go in the Cartesian direction, and one reason why also they could see thought as in natural continuity with animal life. It's just a kind of intensification, if you like, of what Hella Rosen calls the inner touch, or the common sensing that you get in Aristotle. Now, as I've said, the fact that you don't have these sharp dualities in the pre-modern outlook doesn't mean that you've got rid of all mysteries of correlation, I think. It's just that they are more plural. So while it is true that there is a link between the fact that we animals have souls and everything has form, because the soul is the form of forms. So it's as it were, the dwelling place of the idea, where they all foregather. But talking in those terms leaves as mysterious the relationship between form and matter, the hylomorphic relationship that constitutes everything. And it also leaves as mysterious just how it is that a form can be, the form of that table over there is embodied in matter, and yet it's simultaneously in my mind. And again, that's one of the mysteries that people like Occam were trying to get rid of. But the price you then pay is that mind is a strange representational mirror of reality. The idea of knowing by identity seems more natural, but nonetheless, we don't really understand how it is that form can be in those two different ways of being. How do they correlate? How is there a mysterious affinity between them? Nor do we really understand the form-matter relationship. And again, that was something that already with Avicenna, people are trying to rationalize. Whereas, very interestingly, Albert the Great And then Aquinas sometimes talks about a doctrine of elicitation of forms, implying that matter has some strange affinity, attractiveness. It wants to attract forms to itself. And in the case of Albert, he fascinatingly fuses a more rigorously Aristotelian perspective that he gets from Averroes, that insists very strongly on the form-matter unity against the Avicenian tradition. But Albert fuses that with a very Proclean kind of Neoplatonism, whereby there's an emanation from the one that eventually combines with matter, and he blends that also with a Dionysian perspective, whereby, in some sense, the creative receptacle, in its very response, is sort of constituting the cosmos liturgically. In other words, that everything exists as always already praising, or it would not exist at all. So Albert, as Delibera has shown, is one of the great creative minds of the Middle Ages precisely because he makes these kinds of links, and some of that goes into Aquinas. And again, the contrasts are not quite what we think. There's a sense in which when Aquinas is being more Aristotelian, he's also being more Neoplatonic, and for the same reasons, because of this combination of a purified Aristotle with a very Proclean perspective. I need to explain a bit more what that means. The contrast is with Avicenna, who is a much more Platinian thinker. And the key thing about Plotinus, as you will know, is that he believed that the soul was not, our human soul was not fully descended into our body. And for this reason, it's not too much to argue that Plotinus is the long-term ancestor of idealism, because in Plotinus you go inwards and then upwards. And the contrast there is with Iamblichus and Proclus, who believe in the fully descended soul. In other words, you can't sort of go in to go up, but you have to go through your body to go up. And this is why the theurgic Neoplatonists stressed ritual access to the divine. The divine has to descend into ritual. And they remain much truer to the Platonic doctrine of recollection. And the Platonic doctrine of recollection doesn't mean you kind of leave body and world behind, but that you need body and world and ritual as triggers if you are to be reminded of the forms. In other words, the Platonic doctrine of recollection has absolutely nothing to do with a priorism. You don't need the a priori in genuine Platonism. The a priori starts to creep in through Plotinus. It's because he's so Platinian that Avicenna already has the proto-Cartesian doctrine of the flying man, or the idea that you could be fully conscious of yourself without your body. And to this sort of basic Platinianism, Avicenna adds a very particular view of the Platonic ideas, which regards them as a set of kind of atomic units. And these are pre-given as essences, as things which tend to yearn towards reality simply because they are non-contradictory. And in that sense, they start to become a little bit pre-psychic. And it's just for that reason that I think Latin scholastics influenced by Avicenna, Henry of Ghent, Duns Scotus, and so on, start to split things up between sort of given essences on the one hand and the mind thought of either as a mirror or as pure will on the other hand. And all this tends to get away from the priority of creation and of divine government, because you can start to think of essences of things while bracketing creation, leaving it out of account. And when you do think about creation, that tends to be thought of in more purely voluntary terms. It's also bound up with this that Scotus is uneasy with knowledge by species, the idea that the form is migrating into the mind, and instead wants to add to that the pure moment of knowledge is knowledge of esse objectivum, knowledge of an object, when the mind is grasping what it is given through the senses in terms of a given essence. And of course, this is proto-phenomenological. This is, you know, that there are lots of ways in which Husserl is very Scotistic, and his model of intentionality is Scotistic, because he thinks of intentionality as the mind simply intending something within the mind, something given within the mind, whereas the original model of intentionality is deriving from Augustine and is bound up with the semiotic, which David invoked. So it's not that the mind is going towards its thought, it's that the mind generates a thought, an inner word, which then goes towards the outside world. So it's much more inherently relational and realist in character. And it also means that what you might call the phenomenological moment can't readily be separated from a speculative moment. So on the one hand, you can analyze what's going on in our consciousness, but there's never, because our consciousness is always intentional and outward going, intentionality is always a moment of speculation, a moment of, you know, as it were, linguistic interpretation of what it is relating to, which means that there can't be a pure phenomenology of intentionality because it's ecstatic. And in that sense, although phenomenology is a moment, always a moment, I think, in any metaphysics, there is no pre-metaphysical or pre-speculative phenomenological moment. I agree with the so-called speculative realists about this. It's wrong to think that there is phenomenology even as a pure starting point. It's an aspect because obviously it's experiential and we somehow experience what we make up and we're compelled by our own interpretations. Nonetheless, there is an ineliminable interpretive moment. There is, and in a way, that is the implication of Jacques Derrida's deconstruction of Edmund Husserl, even though I don't think he always consistently remained with that implication. So what I'm trying to say is that there is a very big tension in the pre-modern outlook, broadly a tension between the Platonian legacy that encourages you, if you wish to join mind beyond soul, to sort of retreat from the body, and the other Proclean legacy that encourages you much more to sort of paradoxically remain with the body if you want to eventually transcend the body. So that for Aquinas, the route is always through the world. It's through our sensory knowledge. And in a sense, we have to be ever further embedded in that. And perhaps he didn't go far enough in that direction. But that is, I think, the direction of travel. And my worry with the idealist approach is that it loses sight of the fact that our minds cannot create matter. They can, in some way, they are shaping our sensations, but they can't create matter. And so the mind that transcends the body is, is paradoxically characterized by the fact that it can bring about body. So although that mind totally transcends matter, it has within it some kind of ground of matter that we don't have, that our minds alone don't have. The most intimation we can have of that is by remaining mind-body unities. And it's bound up with this kind of thing that, for example, Proclus says that there is a certain sense in which matter reflects something in the one that mind can't do, a certain simplicity that mind can't do. And this is why I'm appealing for a realist Neoplatonism against any kind of idealist temptation, which imagines a non-paradoxical way towards transcendence. You sort of leave behind matter and the world to go upwards. Instead, I'm advocating something much more sacramental. And incidentally, I think Augustine performs the equivalent to the theurgic operation on Plotinus, but in very Christian terms. He's nearly always read wrongly. This is where Rowan Williams' work on Augustine is so important in correcting that misreading, I think. So that's the basic contrast. And therefore I'm suggesting that there's a lot in the fundamental modern outlook that is in continuity with this Avicennian legacy, the legacy that comes through Henry of Ghent and Duns Scotus. And this is compounded by the legacy from Avicenna, which thinks of Platonic ideas as if they were atomic units, because then you get the idea that there's a univocity between the forms in the mind of God and forms as they exist in the finite things. So much so that at one point Bonaventure suggests that the ideas in God are just as much like things in the world as things in the world are like things in God. It becomes far too reversible a notion of correlation. This is why you get plurality of forms in Scotus, because they've become like ingredients in a paint box. And you've lost sight of the idea that it's always a matter of emanative unity going into diversity. And it's within that lineage that the word transcendental undergoes a profound transformation. For Scotus, it starts to mean a sort of a univocal common property around a particular term like being or truth and so forth, that is always the same. Rather than being a common property of being that is analogical and genuinely transgeneric, and something that intensifies as we go up towards God, it becomes something flattened. And precisely for that reason, it starts to have a destiny of transferring towards epistemology from metaphysics. So in a first move, ontology becomes separated from God. Metaphysics becomes entirely about being, almost without reference to God, by the end of the Middle Ages. That's the first move. But then quite naturally, if being is what we can univocally know, that flips over to the idea that the transcendental simply refers to our ineluxable categories of knowing, which is, of course, what occurs in Kant. So all these aspects of the modern epistemological approach are bound up with one particular pre-modern way of thinking about soul, which I think can be challenged by another tradition. So very briefly, how would I characterize what I'm talking about as the other modernity? I think the dominant modernity is all about how thought shapes sensations. And that can seem to be to do with creativity. But in fact, as André de Morault has argued, it's very passive because the a priori structures of mind are determining what we do. So the other tradition within modernity, a much more fragmentary, stuttering kind of tradition, doesn't begin with subjective mind and the question of how far mind is contributing to our perception of the outside world. Instead, and to some extent we know about this through Francis Bacon. Instead, it begins with the fact of artifice. And this is the new factor that comes in with the Renaissance. You start by saying that thought is always caught within artificial processes. So this is not the creativity of mind or matter, it's the creativity of the whole mind-body unit on the outside world. This is why Cusa talks about conjecturing. And he makes a different move in relation to transcendentality by arguing that all thinking is coincident with factibilitas, or with makeability. It's what Vico will later call the convertibility of verum and factum. And this allows then a kind of dynamizing of the traditional analogical understanding of the transcendentals. Being is always becoming, we are always involved in that creative process. And it remains fully ontological because the ultimate consummation of factibilitas is the creation of the world by God and the inner creative process of the Trinity. And I would now want to add to that the importance of the reflections of Bernhard Stiegler, Derrida's most important pupil, and the only person who really concentrates on what matters in Derrida as opposed to what doesn't matter. And Stiegler's main point is quite simple, that no human thought, no human psychic characteristic really exists without the use of language and the use of tools. So much so is this the case that an aporia follows. Is it we who make technology, or is it technology that makes us? And my suggestion here is that it's precisely because of a dim awareness of that aporia that primitive people see ritual as primary, so that everything they do has also been done to them. It has also descended to them. They think, if you like, from the outset theurgically. I think it's precisely when we forget the primacy of ritual that technology runs away and starts to control us, because ritual, if you like, is the technology that can control technology. And I also think that the only possible resolution of the aporia that Stiegler sets up is, again, something like a Trinitarian understanding, that even in God, there is a priority of the word, that when the Father is thinking, it's also true that his thoughts are constituting him. There is a relationality in God for that reason. And then the second way of looking at this new priority to artifice is to suggest that there is a proto-artifice also in the natural world. And this has to do with the priority of habit, as discussed by Maine de Biran and Félix Ravissant in the French 19th century. So if you think of nature not as governed by laws, and why should we do that? If you think of nature as a series of heterogeneous elements and heterogeneous processes that have a kind of obscure but problematic affinity for each other, then it would seem that things only hold together as things, or things only hold together as processes by the formation of habit. And if you like, this is the culture that is already there in nature. We can see it in the pre-organic world. And there's a sense in which higher animal life and intelligence is oddly a kind of return to the pre-organic. I mean, this is probably the kind of thing that some of the German romantics and idealists said, that, you know, birds start building nests and their intelligence is bound up with that. They go back to, as it were, relatively mechanical processes. All our everything we build and shape is in a sense a mortuary monument. It's an involvement with death, but it's precisely because things are dead and that we can then sort of fill them with a different kind of life, a symbolic life. And in that sense, we are consummating and bringing to a new peak this element of culture, this element of habitual artifice that already exists in nature. So what I'm trying to suggest is we shouldn't look at this in terms of we need to go back to the pre-modern account of the soul, but maybe we need to make some concessions to the modern tradition of epistemology. Instead, I think we need to realize that the dominant modern tradition about soul and mind is rooted in one particular pre-modern current, the current going from Plotinus through Avicenna, Henry of Ghent, and Duns Scotus. And we need to look again at the alternative account, which is a blend of Proclus and Averroes' reading of Aristotle, often linked with certain kind of proto-occult element ways of thinking, already in Albert the Great and the Albertines. And we need to think of that tradition not as pre-modern and get accused of nostalgia and so on, but rather as the modern route that was suppressed, and mainly suppressed by the papacy in 1270 and 1277, in favor of a kind of pseudo-piety. We need to see this as an alternative modern way not taken. And by the way, people like Dietrich of Freiberg were just as good at natural science as the nominalists, who were sometimes seen as the only possible route towards modern science. I think that's another enormous myth. But also, it's not a case of simply going back. We need to look again at people like Nicholas of Cusa, who were developing that alternative tradition, but in a specifically modern way. And they were grasping much better than people like Descartes and Kant the real mark of modernity, which is the primacy of artifice. Thank you.